Sometimes, the people who laugh the loudest are standing closest to a secret they were never meant to find. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore and Hale overlooked a gray Montana afternoon wrapped in drifting snow. Beyond the floor-to-soiling windows, the Bitterroot Mountains rested beneath a blanket of clouds, their distant peaks fading into the winter sky, like old memories refusing to disappear. Inside, the air carried the scent of polished oak, leather chairs, and expensive perfume. Everything about the room spoke of wealth, power, and the quiet confidence of people who had never worried about tomorrow. Wyatt Brooks sat at the far end of the long table, feeling as though he had wandered into someone else's life. At 40 years old, he still carried himself like the Army Ranger he had once been. His broad shoulders filled a worn denim jacket that had survived more winters than he cared to count. A faint scar crossed the bridge of his nose, and the silver beginning to appear near his temples seemed older than the years that had placed it there. His blue-gray eyes remained calm, steady, unreadable. Years had taught him that silence often carried more strength than words. At his feet rested Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd, whose black and tan coat gleamed beneath the chandelier light. The dog lay perfectly still, his amber eyes quietly studying every person in the room. Shadow had learned long ago that listening was often more valuable than reacting. Across the table sat the Whitmore family. Logan Whitmore leaned comfortably into a leather chair, one arm draped across the backrest as if the room already belonged to him. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, his gold watch catching flashes of light whenever he moved. The faint smile on his face never quite reached his eyes. Around him sat cousins, relatives, and business associates, all dressed in expensive fabrics and polished confidence. Wyatt recognized the look. It was the look of people already counting money that wasn't yet in their hands. At the head of the table, attorney Daniel Reeves adjusted his glasses and opened the thick leather binder before him. The room gradually settled into silence. Harold Whitmore had been gone for 2 weeks now. The old timber magnate had built an empire from forests and sawmills, but during the final year of his life, it had not been his family sitting beside him through endless medical appointments and lonely evenings. It had been Wyatt. Many nights they had sat together on Harold's porch, watching the sunset burn across the mountains while Shadow rested nearby. Harold rarely spoke about regrets, but when he did, Wyatt listened. Now the old man was gone, and his final wishes were about to be read. Reeves began calmly: properties, investment accounts, vacation homes, company shares. Millions of dollars changed hands through the language of legal documents. Logan's smile grew wider with every page. Several relatives exchanged satisfied glances. Wyatt simply listened. He had not come expecting anything. The divorce years earlier had stripped away nearly everything he owned. He had learned not to build hopes around money. Eventually, Reeves turned another page and paused. For the first time, several people glanced toward Wyatt. Reeves cleared his throat. To Wyatt Brooks, in appreciation for his companionship, loyalty, and assistance during my final years, I leave the sum of $1 US. Silence filled the room for a single heartbeat. Then laughter broke across the table. Logan laughed first. Others followed. Some chuckled quietly. Others openly shook their heads in amusement. Reeves reached into an envelope and slid a crisp $1 bill across the polished wood. The bill stopped directly in front of Wyatt. The laughter lingered. Logan leaned forward. "Well, Wyatt," he said with a grin, "looks like loyalty pays after all." More laughter followed. Wyatt lowered his eyes to the bill. For a long moment he said nothing. The room seemed to wait for disappointment, anger, or embarrassment. Instead, he calmly reached forward and picked it up. The paper felt strangely cold between his fingers. Beside him, Shadow slowly lifted his head. The German shepherd stared at the dollar bill without blinking, his ears tilted forward. His gaze lingered on the folded corner longer than seemed natural. Wyatt noticed but said nothing. Carefully, he folded the bill once and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he rose from his chair. The laughter faded. "That's it?" Logan asked. Wyatt rested a hand on Shadow's neck. The dog immediately stood beside him. "That's enough," Wyatt replied quietly. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Snow drifted beyond the glass as Shadow followed at his side. Neither of them saw the expression that briefly crossed Daniel Reeves's face as they left the room. It wasn't pity. It wasn't regret. It was anticipation. Because hidden inside that simple dollar bill was something no one else in that room had even thought to look for. And before another sunrise touched the Bitterroot Mountains, everything they believed about Harold Whitmore's inheritance would begin to unravel. The storm arrived sometime after midnight. Snow drifted across the narrow valley, where Wyatt's small cabin stood alone among the pines. and the wind brushed against the walls with the soft patience of something searching for a way inside. A fire crackled quietly in the stone hearth, while Shadow slept near the front door, his head resting on his paws. Wyatt sat in an old wooden chair, staring at the folded dollar bill lying on the table beside a half-empty coffee mug. The room smelled faintly of cedar smoke and black coffee. He had tried to sleep twice already, but every time he closed his eyes, he found himself back in that conference room listening to laughter. Finally, he shook his head and stood. $1, he muttered. You always did have a strange sense of humor, Harold. Shadow lifted one ear but remained still. Wyatt picked up the bill again. Something about it felt unusual. Perhaps it was simply the way Shadow kept watching it. The dog rarely paid attention to paper, yet every time the bill appeared, those amber eyes seemed to lock onto it. Wyatt turned it over beneath the lamplight. Nothing. Just an ordinary dollar. He sighed and slipped it back into his jacket pocket before heading toward bed. Less than 6 hours later, the sound of tires crunching over fresh snow echoed outside. Shadow was already on his feet before Wyatt heard it. The German Shepherd stood motionless beside the window, ears raised, body alert. A low rumble vibrated in his chest. Wyatt glanced at the clock, 6:15 in the morning. Nobody visited this far into the mountains before sunrise. He stepped onto the porch as cold air swept across the clearing. A black SUV sat at the end of the driveway, its headlights glowing through the falling snow. The driver's door opened. Daniel Reeves stepped out wearing a long wool coat and dark gloves. He looked tired. Wyatt folded his arms. You lawyers start working early. Reeves offered a small smile. Not usually. Then what brings you out here before breakfast? For a moment, Reeves simply studied him. Snow gathered on his shoulders. Finally, he said, May I come inside? Minutes later, they sat near the fire while Shadow remained standing beside Wyatt's chair. The dog never took his eyes off the attorney. Reeves warmed his hands near the flames before speaking. Harold left instructions. Wyatt frowned. The will was read yesterday. Not all of it. The room grew quiet. Outside, wind swept through the trees. Wyatt leaned forward slightly. What exactly are you saying? Reeves reached into his coat pocket and removed a sealed envelope. The paper looked old. The edges had yellowed with age. Across the front was written one name in neat handwriting. Wyatt Brooks. Wyatt immediately recognized Harold's handwriting. His chest tightened. When did he give you this? 8 months ago, Reeves replied. He instructed me to deliver it only after the will was read, and only if you accepted what happened without making a scene. Wyatt let out a short laugh. So, this was some kind of test? Harold believed character reveals itself when nobody is watching. Wyatt carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet. He read silently. Then he stopped halfway through. His eyes narrowed. This does not make any sense. Reeves nodded slowly. I felt the same way the first time I read it. Wyatt looked up. Harold says the dollar is not the inheritance. Correct. Then what is it? Before Reeves could answer, Shadow suddenly stepped forward. The German Shepherd's gaze fixed on Wyatt's jacket pocket where the folded bill rested. His ears stood high. You see that? Reeves asked quietly. Wyatt nodded. Shadow moved closer and touched his nose against the pocket once. Then again, almost deliberately, Reeves lowered his voice. Harold specifically mentioned the dog. Wyatt blinked. What? His exact words were, trust Shadow when the road becomes difficult. Silence settled over the cabin. The fire popped softly. Reeves reached into his briefcase and removed a weathered map. He unfolded it across the table. Snow-covered mountains filled the page. One location had been circled in red ink, deep within the Bitterroot Range. Wyatt stared at it. What is this place? Reeves met his eyes. That, Wyatt, is where Harold's real legacy begins. The black SUV climbed steadily through the Bitterroot Mountains as morning light spilled across the snow-covered ridges. Frost clung to the pine branches like silver dust, and the winding road disappeared around one bend after another. Wyatt sat in the passenger seat studying the old map spread across his lap while Shadow occupied the back seat, unusually restless for a dog who normally slept during long drives. Every few minutes, the German Shepherd would lift his head and stare through the window as though searching for something hidden among the endless trees. Daniel Reeves kept both hands on the steering wheel. Harold purchased that section of land nearly 30 years ago, he said. Yet somehow nobody in the family ever knew it existed. Wyatt looked up. A man does not hide hundreds of acres without a reason. Exactly. The attorney nodded. That is what has bothered me. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield. The farther they traveled, the fewer signs of civilization remained. Small towns vanished behind them. Gas stations disappeared. Eventually, even power lines became rare. The mountains seemed to swallow everything except the narrow road ahead. Shadow suddenly stood. his paws pressed against the rear seat as he stared toward the forest. A low whine escaped his throat. Wyatt glanced back. "What is it, boy?" The dog remained focused on the trees. Daniel noticed. "He has been doing that for the last 10 miles. Wyatt scratched his jaw thoughtfully. Shadow usually reacts when something changes. "You think he senses where we are going?" Wyatt gave a faint smile. "I stopped questioning that dog years ago." Another 20 minutes passed before they reached a rusted gate standing between two stone pillars. The metal chain hanging across it looked untouched by human hands for decades. Daniel parked the SUV and stepped outside. Cold mountain air rushed across the clearing. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Shadow jumped out immediately and trotted toward the gate. His ears stood tall. His tail remained perfectly still. Daniel unlocked the chain using a small brass key taken from his coat pocket. The gate groaned open with a sound that echoed through the silent valley. Beyond it stretched a narrow trail leading deeper into the wilderness. "This is private property?" Wyatt asked. "According to county records, yes." Daniel folded the key into his palm, and according to Harold, everything begins at the end of this trail. They continued on foot. The path wound through towering pines and frozen creeks. Sunlight filtered through the branches in pale golden beams. Nearly a mile later, Shadow stopped abruptly. Wyatt almost walked into him. The dog lowered his nose to the snow and began circling a small clearing. "Shadow?" Wyatt called. The German Shepherd ignored him. Daniel frowned. "What is he doing?" Before Wyatt could answer, Shadow pawed at the snow. Once, twice, then again. Wyatt approached and knelt beside him. Beneath the powder lay a flat piece of weathered stone. He brushed away more snow. Strange markings appeared across the surface. Not words, symbols. Carefully carved decades earlier. Daniel's eyes widened. "I have seen that symbol before." Wyatt looked at him. "Where?" "In Harold's letter." Daniel reached into his coat and removed a folded photograph he had not shown before. It depicted the same symbol engraved on a wooden beam somewhere underground. Wyatt stared at it. "Why did you not mention this?" "Because Harold instructed me not to unless we found the marker first." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Wind moved softly through the trees overhead. Then Shadow stepped away from the stone and looked toward a distant ridge. His ears tilted forward. His body became perfectly still. Wyatt followed his gaze. Far beyond the clearing, partially hidden among the pines, stood the outline of an old cabin that did not appear on the map. The cabin stood at the edge of the ridge like a forgotten memory buried beneath snow and time. Its weathered logs had darkened with age, and the roof sagged slightly beneath years of mountain winters. No smoke rose from the chimney, no tracks surrounded it except their own. Yet something about the place felt watched. Wyatt studied the structure quietly. "Harold owned this?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not officially, at least not according to any records I could find." Shadow was already moving. The German Shepherd crossed the clearing with deliberate steps, nose low to the ground. He circled the cabin once, then stopped near the front porch. His ears lifted. A soft whine escaped his throat. "He found something," Wyatt said. The front door resisted at first. When Wyatt pushed harder, the old hinges groaned and the door slowly opened inward. Cold air spilled from the darkness beyond. Dust coated everything inside. A stone fireplace occupied one wall. A wooden table sat near the window. Time seemed frozen there. Daniel removed a flashlight from his coat. Its beam swept across shelves lined with books, old lanterns, and tools that looked untouched for decades. "This place should not exist," Daniel murmured. Wyatt walked slowly through the main room. "Harold brought me here once." Daniel looked surprised. "He did?" Wyatt nodded. "Years ago, we stopped during a fishing trip. He only stayed 10 minutes, never explained why." Shadow suddenly barked once. The sharp sound echoed through the cabin. Both men turned. The dog stood beside the fireplace, staring at the floor. Wyatt approached. "What is it, boy?" Shadow scratched the wooden boards twice. Then he stepped back. Wyatt knelt and examined the floor. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then his fingers brushed against a narrow seam hidden beneath dust. "Daniel." The attorney moved closer. Together, they cleared away years of dirt and debris. A square outline slowly appeared, a concealed panel. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Well." Wyatt found a small metal ring embedded in the wood. He pulled. The panel lifted with surprising ease. Beneath it rested a narrow compartment containing a weatherproof tin box. Shadow sat beside it immediately, tail resting on the floor, watching silently. Wyatt carefully opened the box. Inside lay several folded documents, an old brass compass, and a yellowed envelope bearing Harold's handwriting. Wyatt unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the page. "What does it say?" Daniel asked. Wyatt read aloud. "If you are standing here, then you trusted the road more than the destination. Good. You are exactly where you are supposed to be." Daniel smiled faintly. "That sounds like Harold." Wyatt continued reading. The mountain protects what men often destroy. Follow the compass, trust Shadow, and do not let Logan reach the truth before you do. The room fell silent. Daniel's expression changed immediately. Logan? Wyatt lowered the letter. Harold knew Logan would come after this. Before either man could speak again, a sound drifted through the cabin. Not from inside, from outside, the distant growl of an engine climbing the mountain road. Shadow sprang to his feet. Every muscle in his body tightened. Wyatt moved toward the window and looked through the frosted glass. Far below, partially hidden among the pines, a dark vehicle was slowly making its way toward the ridge. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The distant engine echoed through the mountains, fading and returning as the vehicle climbed the winding road below. Snow drifted past the cabin windows in slow spirals. Daniel stepped away from the glass. If that is Logan, he should not know about this place. Wyatt folded Harold's letter and slipped it into his jacket. You are assuming somebody did not tell him. Daniel's expression darkened. The only people who knew about the map were Harold and me. Shadow suddenly crossed the room and nudged the old brass compass resting inside the tin box. The needle spun wildly for a moment before settling toward the north wall of the cabin. The dog stared at it. Then he looked at Wyatt. You see that? Wyatt asked quietly. Daniel nodded. I have never seen a compass behave like that indoors. Wyatt picked it up. The moment he lifted it, the needle shifted again. Not north, east, directly toward the rear wall. Shadow immediately trotted across the room and stopped beside a tall wooden bookshelf. The German shepherd's ears rose. His tail remained perfectly still. Harold said, follow the compass, Wyatt said. Maybe this is what he meant. Together they moved toward the shelf. Years of dust covered the books. Most appeared to be journals about forestry, land surveys, and mountain geology. Wyatt ran his hand across the wood. Nothing seemed unusual. Then Shadow pressed his nose against the lower corner. A soft click echoed through the room. Daniel blinked. Tell me I imagined that. Wyatt pushed gently against the shelf. The entire structure shifted several inches. Hidden behind it was a narrow passage carved directly into the mountain rock. Cold air flowed from the darkness beyond. For a moment, all three simply stared. Daniel laughed softly. Harold never did anything halfway. Wyatt grabbed a lantern hanging near the fireplace and lit it. Warm light spilled into the passage. The tunnel stretched deeper than either man expected. Stone walls disappeared into shadow. Shadow entered first without hesitation. His nails clicked softly against the rock floor. He is not waiting for permission, Daniel said. Wyatt followed. The tunnel sloped downward for nearly 50 yards before opening into a chamber beneath the cabin. The ceiling rose nearly 20 feet overhead. Ancient support beams crossed the stone walls. Shelves lined the room, crates, filing cabinets, metal lockboxes. Everything sat preserved in the cold, dry air. Daniel stared in disbelief. Good Lord. Wyatt slowly turned in a circle. What is all this? Shadow moved toward a large workbench positioned against the far wall. On top rested a leather portfolio protected beneath a sheet of glass. Wyatt carefully lifted it. Inside were deeds, survey maps, ownership certificates, and photographs stretching back decades. Daniel picked up one document and read silently. His eyes widened, then he read it again. Wyatt. What? This is impossible. He handed over the paper. Wyatt scanned the page. The document listed thousands of acres of timberland, mineral rights, and mountain property spread across multiple counties, all held under private trusts created by Harold Whitmore over 30 years earlier. Wyatt looked up slowly. How much land are we talking about? Daniel swallowed. Enough that nobody would ever call this a forgotten cabin again. Before Wyatt could respond, Shadow let out a sharp bark, one single warning bark, the kind that always meant something important. Both men turned. On the far side of the chamber stood a heavy steel door built directly into the mountain. And above the door, carved into the stone, was the same symbol they had discovered beneath the snow. The steel door looked older than everything around it. Time had stained its surface dark gray, and small flecks of rust traced the edges like forgotten fingerprints. The symbol carved above it seemed even older, cut deep into the mountain stone by hands that had expected it to remain hidden for generations. Shadow stood directly in front of the door. His amber eyes never left it. Wyatt stepped beside him and rested a hand on the dog's neck. You found it, did you not? Shadow's ears twitched. Daniel slowly approached. I spent 20 years handling Harold's legal affairs. 20 years, and somehow I never knew this existed. Wyatt examined the heavy locking mechanism. Maybe that was the point. He pulled Harold's compass from his pocket. The needle immediately spun before settling directly toward the center of the steel door. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Daniel frowned. Wait. He pointed toward a small circular slot hidden beneath layers of dust. That is not a normal lock. Wyatt brushed the dust away. The opening was narrow, almost the exact width of a folded dollar bill. Both men froze. Daniel stared at him. "You are kidding." Wyatt slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed the dollar bill. The same bill that had crossed the conference table, while people laughed. The paper looked ordinary beneath the lantern light. Yet suddenly, nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. "Harold planned this from the beginning," Daniel whispered. Wyatt carefully unfolded the bill. Along one edge, nearly invisible without close inspection, tiny markings had been etched into the paper. Coordinates, numbers, symbols matching the carving above the door. "I never saw these." Daniel shook his head. Neither did anyone else. Wyatt slid the bill gently into the slot. A soft metallic click echoed through the chamber. Then another. Deep inside the mountain, hidden gears began turning. Stone dust drifted from the ceiling. Shadow stepped backward. The massive lock released with a heavy thud. Slowly the steel door moved inward. Cold air rolled out from the darkness beyond. The chamber behind it was enormous. Shelves stretched across the walls. Filing cabinets stood in neat rows. Metal cases rested on reinforced racks. But it was not treasure that captured Wyatt's attention. It was the records, thousands of documents, survey maps, mineral reports, timber assessments, land ownership certificates, decades of careful planning preserved in perfect order. Daniel opened one cabinet and immediately sat down on a nearby crate. "Oh my goodness." Wyatt walked over. "What?" Daniel handed him a file. "Read the trust valuation." Wyatt scanned the page. His eyes narrowed, then widened. The number seemed impossible. Additional files revealed more holdings, more land, more assets, more investments tied directly to the mountain properties Harold had quietly assembled over 3 decades. "This cannot be real," Wyatt said. Daniel looked at him carefully. "It is real," he exhaled slowly. "And Harold left every controlling document to you." Silence settled over the underground chamber. Wyatt stared across the rows of records. Wealth was not what struck him. It was trust. Somehow through all those years Harold had chosen him, not his family, not his company executives. Him. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Wyatt immediately turned. The dog was staring toward the tunnel entrance. Daniel heard it too, faint at first. Then unmistakable. Footsteps, more than one set, coming from somewhere above. Shadow's growl deepened as the footsteps echoed through the tunnel above. Wyatt immediately set the file back onto the table and listened. The sounds were faint but unmistakable. Someone had entered the cabin. Daniel's face tightened. "How many?" Wyatt shook his head. "At least 2. The attorney glanced toward the rows of documents. "Nobody besides us should know this place exists." Shadow took several slow steps toward the tunnel entrance, every muscle tense. Then a voice drifted down through the passage. "I know you are down there." Wyatt closed his eyes briefly. He recognized the voice instantly. Logan Whitmore. Daniel let out a long breath. "So much for secrecy." Another voice followed. "Logan, maybe we should wait for the sheriff." Logan answered sharply. "I am done waiting." Wyatt looked toward Daniel. "You called anyone?" "No." "Then somebody followed us." The attorney nodded grimly. Above them, floorboards creaked. Logan spoke again. "Wyatt, you might as well come up. Whatever you found belongs to my family." Wyatt remained calm. He had spent years learning that the loudest person in a room was rarely the strongest. Shadow glanced back at him. The dog seemed to be waiting for direction. Wyatt rested a hand on his neck. "Easy, boy." Daniel lowered his voice. "What do we do?" Wyatt looked around the chamber. Thousands of documents surrounded them. Evidence, history, proof. Then his eyes landed on another leather binder sitting alone on a nearby shelf. Unlike everything else, it bore Harold's name stamped in gold across the cover. Wyatt picked it up. "What is that?" Daniel asked. Wyatt opened it. Inside were handwritten entries spanning nearly 20 years, journal pages, letters, notes. Halfway through the binder, he stopped. A folded document rested between 2 pages. The title immediately caught his attention. "Final Declaration." Daniel stepped closer. "Read it." Wyatt scanned the page. The room grew very quiet. Finally, he smiled. "Harold thought of everything." "What does it say?" "It says that if anyone contests ownership of these properties, this declaration becomes active immediately." Daniel's eyes widened. "Legally active?" "Signed, witnessed, notarized, and recorded." Above them, Logan's voice echoed again. "Wyatt." This time Wyatt answered. "What do you want, Logan?" Silence followed for a moment. Then Logan replied, "I want what belongs to my father." Wyatt looked down at Harold's declaration. "Funny thing," he called back. "Your father seems to disagree." The silence that followed lasted longer. Daniel almost laughed. Shadow's ears suddenly twitched. The German shepherd turned away from the tunnel and trotted toward the far side of the chamber. Wyatt watched him carefully. "Now what?" Shadow stopped beside a small wooden desk hidden behind several filing cabinets. He placed one paw against the bottom drawer. Once. Then again. Wyatt walked over and opened it. Inside rested a single VHS tape and a handwritten note. Daniel stared. "Please tell me that says what I think it says." Wyatt unfolded the note. Harold's familiar handwriting covered the page. "For Wyatt Brooks and anyone who doubts the truth." Wyatt looked up slowly. Somewhere above, Logan continued pacing across the cabin floor. But deep beneath the mountain, Harold Whitmore had just reached across time one final time, and whatever was recorded on that tape was about to change everything. Wyatt turned the VHS tape over in his hands while the distant sound of Logan's footsteps continued above. Dust clung to the plastic case. A small label had been attached to the front years ago. In Harold's handwriting were 6 simple words: "Open only when the time comes." Daniel stared at it. "Do you realize what this could be?" Wyatt nodded slowly. "The answer." Shadow sat beside the desk, watching quietly. His tail brushed once against the stone floor. For the first time since entering the mountain chamber, the dog seemed calm. Wyatt slipped the tape into his backpack, along with Harold's declaration and the most important documents. "We need to get out of here," Daniel said. "If Logan sees any of this before we understand it, everything becomes a mess." Wyatt agreed. They moved quickly through the tunnel and emerged back into the cabin. Logan stood near the fireplace with another man Wyatt recognized as one of Whitmore Timber's corporate attorneys. The moment Logan saw them, his expression hardened. "There you are." His eyes moved from Wyatt to the backpack. "What did you find?" Wyatt calmly removed his gloves. "An old cabin." Logan laughed. "Try again." Daniel stepped forward. "Logan, this property is legally protected." "Protected by who?" Logan snapped. "My father is gone." Wyatt met his gaze. "Your father planned further ahead than you think." Logan's eyes narrowed. "Whatever he hid belongs to his family. Maybe that is why he hid it from them," Wyatt replied. Silence filled the room. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Logan looked ready to argue again when Daniel spoke. "There is a recorded statement that immediately changed everything." "A statement?" Logan asked. "From Harold himself." The attorney beside Logan straightened. "Recorded when?" "Years ago," Daniel answered. Logan folded his arms. "Then we watch it." 2 days later, the conference room at Whitmore and Hale was full once again. The same polished table, the same mountain view beyond the windows. Yet the mood felt completely different. Wyatt sat quietly with Shadow, resting beside his chair. Logan occupied the opposite side of the room. Several attorneys were present. A television had been placed at the front. Daniel inserted the tape. Static flickered across the screen. Then Harold Whitmore appeared, older, thinner, but unmistakably himself. The room fell silent. Harold looked directly into the camera. "If you are watching this, then somebody finally found what I spent 30 years protecting." He paused and smiled faintly. "Especially if Logan is in the room." Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Harold continued, "This recording exists because I know there will be questions, maybe even arguments. So let me make this simple." He leaned forward. "Every trust, every property, every holding connected to the mountain belongs exactly where I intended it to belong." Logan shifted in his chair. Harold's eyes seemed to lock onto him through time itself. "Money reveals character, so does disappointment. That is why I left one final test." Wyatt remained motionless. Shadow quietly lifted his head. Harold smiled again. "If Wyatt Brooks is watching this, then he passed. If Shadow is sitting beside him, then I know I made the right choice." Across the room, Logan's confidence began to fade as Harold reached for a document and held it up to the camera. "And now I suppose it is time everyone learns what I really left behind." The conference room remained completely silent as Harold Whitmore continued speaking from the screen. The years seemed to fall away from his face as he looked directly into the camera with the same calm certainty Wyatt remembered from countless evenings on the porch. Harold held up the document in his hand. "The Mountain Trust was never created to make someone rich," he said. "It was created to protect something valuable from people who only understood value as a number." Logan's jaw tightened. Harold continued, "Over 3 decades I assembled those lands, resources, and investments under a private trust because I wanted them preserved, not divided and sold. The person who receives them must understand stewardship, not ownership." The room remained still. Harold smiled faintly. "That person is Wyatt Brooks." Logan immediately stood. "This is ridiculous." One of the attorneys beside him touched his arm. "Sit down." Harold's recorded voice continued, "If you are upset by my decision, then perhaps you have proven why I made it." Several people lowered their eyes. Wyatt remained silent. Shadow rested calmly beside him. Harold turned serious. "During the final years of my life, many people visited when they wanted something. Wyatt visited when I needed someone. There is a difference." Daniel Reeves quietly folded his hands. Harold nodded toward the camera. The trust, the land, the mineral rights, the timber holdings, and all associated assets belong to Wyatt Brooks under the terms already filed and legally protected. He paused. And before anyone asks, yes, every document has been reviewed by enough attorneys to survive any challenge. A few soft chuckles moved through the room. Even Daniel smiled. Logan did not. Then Harold's expression softened. Wyatt, if you are watching this, then I hope you remember our last conversation. You told me a man does not need much if he has purpose. I agreed. That is why I am leaving you responsibility instead of a reward. For the first time, Wyatt looked away from the screen. His throat tightened. Harold glanced downward and smiled. And Shadow, if that old dog is still sitting beside you, give him an extra biscuit from me. The room laughed gently. Even Wyatt could not stop a small smile. The recording ended moments later. The screen faded to black. Nobody spoke. Finally, Daniel stood. Legally speaking, Harold's intentions could not be clearer. Logan stared out the window toward the distant mountains. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then, without another argument, he picked up his coat and quietly left the room. Months passed. Spring arrived in the Bitterroots. Snow melted from the valleys. Rivers ran clear again. Wildflowers returned to the hillsides surrounding the old cabin. Wyatt spent his days restoring trails, repairing structures, and creating programs that helped struggling veterans find work and housing across the region. The trust became a force for rebuilding lives rather than accumulating wealth. One afternoon, Daniel arrived carrying a small frame wrapped in brown paper. I thought you might want this. Wyatt opened it. Inside, preserved behind glass, rested a $1 bill, the same one that had started everything. Wyatt laughed softly. Seemed strange seeing it framed. Daniel smiled. Not really. It opened the only door that mattered. Later that evening, the sun settled behind the mountains in waves of gold and amber. Wyatt sat on the cabin porch while Shadow rested beside him. The framed dollar bill hung near the front door, where the fading light could reach it. A cool breeze moved through the pines. For a long time, neither man nor dog moved. They simply watched the mountains, the same mountains that had guarded Harold's secret for decades. Finally, Wyatt reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ears. Looks like he knew what he was doing after all. Shadow leaned against his leg and closed his eyes. Beyond the porch, the last sunlight touched the distant ridge before slowly disappearing into evening. And for the first time in many years, Wyatt Brooks felt exactly where he belonged. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.